It's a very, very rare movie that one rooted in history sparks a debate as intense and a passionate one as Kashmir Files has. But it's also rare to see a mass migration coupled with atrocities as abhorrent as witnessed by Kashmiri Hindus in the 90s. After 32 years, the pain of being tortured and hounded out of their homes is still raw for the victims of that Hindu genocide in Kashmir, and it became very, very apparent during the screening of the film across the country. But now a fresh debate has erupted about whether this film is an effort at trying to change the narrative, to make it more conducive to the government in power, about whether it is writing history altogether. But is the pain of people conveniently being dismissed as propaganda? So ultimately, a lot of criticism that is directed at the Kashmir Files is about trying to control the narrative. What is it about history, narrative, storytelling, and how sometimes the line between all of them blurs? Joining me right now is Ashwin Sanghi, renowned author, needs no introduction. But Ashwin Sanghi, I want you to start by responding to this criticism that essentially this is a narrative being created which is convenient to the current government and ideology.
First of all, wonderful to be on your show, Padmaja. But honestly speaking, when it comes down to the concept of history, I believe somewhere along the way we have lost the plot. I mean, the truth of the matter is that if we look at the last couple of years, we've seen a spate of statues being pulled down. And many of those were very understandable. For example, slave owners and slave traders and so on and so forth. But we've also seen a lot of people who, for whom history was rather kind. For example, let's say the Churchills of the world and the Mahatma Gandhis of the world. And still we found that there was a problem with their statues. Now, this is all related back to narratives. And frankly, what is really different is the fact that you have an event in 1857 in India, which is called the Great Rebellion of 1857, but it is taught in English history books as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. We are referring to the exact same event, Padmaja. So the point is that what changes is in terms of the vision. And for any historian who says that I don't bring in a bias into my narrative, they are completely lying. So the challenge really lies in terms of how to be able to read between the lines. And unfortunately, to a very great extent, it is really, to a certain extent, people wanting to preserve their version of the narrative as it were told. My personal view is that history, the only way to be able to learn it is that you cannot compromise on facts, but the interpretation of those facts is something that you can have multiple viewpoints on. To my mind, the solution lies, whether it's in the matter of statues or whether it's in the matter of narratives, the answer is don't be selective. Let thousands of them flourish and allow history to be understood as an inexact narration of events which is often colored by the sensibilities of the narrator. Allow all sides to have their say.
Okay, so essentially, instead of saying that Kashmir Files should not be watched or this is a bad film, make many, many films on Kashmir so that all of them can coexist. But sure.
And if I may interject, for example, we've already had films like, let us say, Shikara or Haider, which have been films which aren't strictly historical films, but at the end of the day, they were presenting a perspective. They were presenting a slightly gentler side to the entire narrative around Kashmir. So honestly speaking, I don't see a reason why people should have a problem with the presentation of the Kashmir Files, which is providing a particular dimension to the story.
So here is why people have a problem.
Padmaja, how would you react in the event that a movie related to the Holocaust was presented in terms of trying to understand the Nazi perspective or trying to make the Holocaust a little more acceptable? Would you react the same way?
But here's the thing. People say that to compare what happened in Kashmir to the Holocaust is in itself a false equivalence. And since you asked what is the problem in having a Kashmir Files, people are saying you're trying to whip up hate against Muslims.
No, but that's not true. We have to go back again. Can I take a step back and go a little bit we are thinking of this problem of Kashmir from the 1990s perspective, Padmaja. But this is not a problem which relates only to the 1990s. We have to go back in time. Over the years, what has happened is that think about this. The primary deity of Kashmir, antiquity Kashmir, was Sharda, a manifestation of Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom, whose prayers refer to her as Kashmir Purvasini, the one who resides in Kashmir. And looking at today's Muslim majority Kashmir Valley, it's easy to forget that Kashmir was part of the Maurya Empire, the Kushan Empire, then it was part of the Huns, the Karakotas, the Utpals, the Lauharas. One forgets that the land derived its name from Rishi Kashyap and the goddess Kashmira. One forgets that Adi Shankaracharya traveled from Kanyakumari to there. So there is a rich Buddhist and Shaivite history around Kashmir, which has been completely forgotten. We have forgotten the fact that we might have lost the Charak Samhita had it not been for a great physician from Kashmir. We have forgotten that the Yoga Vashisht was written there. The greatest Buddhist council was held by Kanishk in Kashmir. So the codification of Buddhist doctrine was done in Kashmir. And so there is a lot of rich heritage and history, which is Hindu and Buddhist in nature. But after the 8th century, Padmaja, the Islamic conquests began. And in the 8th century, of course, you had the Arab trader Junaid attacking, who was repelled by Lalit Aditya. Then you had the raids of Ghazni around 1002 CE. And he was also defeated by Sangram Raja. But by then, some of the tribals in the border areas had begun to convert. And along the way, a lot of the Muslim traders and fakirs started settling down in Kashmir. What followed, Padmaja, was a very, very bloody history, which has been completely forgotten. We had a prominent mystic known as Bulbul Shah, a Sufi from Turkestan, who arrived in Kashmir. And at that time, the Hindu Raja was Ramachandra. He had a Buddhist advisor known as Rinchen, who converted to Islam along with 10,000 other Brahmins. And that's the first time that you suddenly realize that Hindus could no longer pray, they could not follow their rituals, they could not follow their traditions. Even having a mark on the head like a tilak was banned. Hindu temples and Buddhist viharas began to be demolished. Books were burnt, gold and silver from the idols was melted. There is a spot in Kashmir known as Bhatta Mazar, which came to be known as the graveyard of Kashmiri Pandits, with several hundreds of them having been burnt or drowned. And the atrocities continued under various kings. Sultan Ali, who ensured that fleeing Hindus were captured and killed. There was Hyder Shah, who overlooked the chopping of noses of Brahmins. So the point I'm making, Padmaja, is that this is not a story of the 1990s. This is a story that goes back 600 years.
But I'm going to turn that around and, playing the devil's advocate, say for what Bulbul Shah did or Hyder Ali did, should Muslims, Indian Muslims of the 90s, of the 70s, of the 80s be demonized?
Not at all. I have always believed that, in fact, you cannot hold any particular community to be responsible for the acts of their ancestors.
But the charge is that these movies are demonizing Indian Muslims. How do you respond to that?
Padmaja, what we are talking about is something which I consider to be truth and reconciliation. And unfortunately, truth and reconciliation are not parallel. They are sequential. In that sense, if you want reconciliation, first you have to acknowledge the truth. The problem with us is that in India, from 1947, we allowed only a certain perspective to emerge as far as the historical narrative was concerned. My personal view is that today, if you start going back and raking up how many times did Muhammad Ghazni invade Somnath temple, or what was the brutality that was there during the Church Inquisition, the Goa Inquisition, then we can go on, we can write reams and reams, and reams have already been written. I am not suggesting even for a moment that we should be holding today's communities, non-Hindu communities, responsible for what happened in history. All I'm saying is that we had, for example, a Nanavati commission which inquired into the Nanavati Mehta commission, which inquired into the Gujarat riots. We had another Nanavati commission which inquired into the Sikh massacre of 1984. And yet, when the Supreme Court was approached in order to say, hey, listen, what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits in 1990? Why don't we have a commission? Why don't we find what is the truth? What exactly happened? Because you look at the numbers are also varying tremendously. The official numbers are like maybe about roughly 218 odd Pandits died. But there are many, many Pandit organizations which say, no, that the deaths were 1,000. Someone says that, no, they were 399. So we don't even have a number. We don't even know how many people eventually fled. The numbers vary from 3.5 lakhs to 5 lakhs. Isn't it about time that we got someone to evaluate all of this so that we can come to terms with the truth and then live our lives as normal?
Okay, one part is the legal part where we're completely in agreement that there needed to be done, much more needed to be done by the governments. Talking about theatre, talking about film, talking about this storytelling, you spoke of reconciliation. Can there be reconciliation when now in popular cinema, in popular narrative, you are raking up old wounds and pitting community versus community, neighbors versus neighbor? That's the criticism.
No, my personal view is that, frankly, by that logic, should we say that today's Germany should never have existed and should not have had any relationships with Israel or the Jews on account of the number of films that were created around the atrocities of World War II? I mean, look at what Hollywood has done with some of the historical events, and they've been done to death. Please excuse the pun. So the point I'm making is, are we really so insecure that we cannot accept a point of view? I don't believe we are. And at the end of the day, what is, as a person who has always written books which are based loosely on historical facts and then combined it with fiction, I am fully aware of the fact that it's a very, very fine line to tread. How do you bring in the fact? How do you bring in the historical narrative and yet at the same time craft a fictional story around it? And of course, that is that very tantalizing space, Padmaja, where you don't know what is fact and what is fiction. But I must tell you, after sitting through 3 hours of the Kashmir Files, I found that most of it was actually much more of a documentary in the sense, in terms of actual narratives that have emerged from the survivors. And as a result of which, I can't see a reason as to why a movie like the Kashmir Files should be seen as any sort of attack on the Muslim community. That's nonsense.
Finally, let me ask you, it's said that history is written by the victor. Is there a sense also that अब हमारी सरकार है तो हमारी वाली हिस्ट्री बताई जाएगी, largely because there has been this conflation of Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus vis-a-vis the RSS, the BJP. So now we will tell our version of history.
You see, it was, I think, George Orwell who said that he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. So this has happened again and again, where you've had governments coming in and they have wanted to color history according to their own sensibilities, according to their own opinions, according to their own inherent biases. My personal view, Padmaja, is that the answer is not in terms of trying to, people use this phrase, rewriting history. Let's not rewrite it. What is there is already there. But today, for example, if there is a gap in, let's say, our understanding of someone like a Veer Savarkar, what is wrong in terms of, let's say, Vikram Sampath coming up with a couple of volumes related to the gaps in the Veer Savarkar life? And in case there are a couple of other people who feel that, no, what he has said is wrong, then they should have the liberty of being able to come out with a couple of books to say, listen, you're wrong. The point is, the way I have always looked at history is that you are sitting in a cinema where you are watching a 3D film. But to watch that 3D film, you need to put on 3D glasses. Because what is happening in that 3D film is that you are being hit by multiple beams of light. And those multiple beams of light need to be somehow or the other consolidated into one view that your eyes can capture. That is exactly what history needs to be. You need to have all of those multiple narratives, and then you need to allow people to make up their minds as to whether they believe that narrative, whether it is a justifiable narrative, whether the event evidence supports that narrative or not.
Couldn't have put it better. Thanks very much, Ashwin Sanghi. Pleasure as always to speak to you. The many dimensions of history, and let your mind be the prism through which all of it can be filtered for one view, which is your individual view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Padmaja.